there's a lot of brain science that say our brains are actually wired to only feel 8 emotions. Like they've done this. Have you ever heard this? That like mapping our brains, and there's only 8 distinct places that light up.
Yeah.
So maybe we think of it like the primary colors. Like there's, red, yellow, blue. But then there's millions of shades of colors because you combine them and you get this nuance. So I think like, for instance, frustration's not on the 8 core emotions, but it would be a flavor of anger. So maybe it's a little bit of this and this, or anxious might be a little bit of fear, and then maybe some anger, or it could just be fear, whatever. So the idea of keeping it to the 8 was really helpful for me because it was like, I didn't feel overwhelmed.
Hi, welcome back to Havilah's podcast. Today, we're continuing the conversation around emotional health. Yes, it's different than spiritual health. It's different than mental health. It is emotional health and it's spiritual. And here's the thing, we're learning that a healthy emotional, ecosystem really changes your relationships with yourself, with others, and with God. So today I'm not alone. I invited a friend of mine, and really, I think an expert in this field only because she's the one I go to when I want to unpack my emotions. But Jenna Zint, the founder of Habit Lab, and your problem-solving queen, is here today to have a conversation about this. Now, I want you to understand that when I first took Jenna's class, she has this amazing course called Habit Lab. It's live. It's a masterclass. She does it multiple times a year. I signed up. I was going in to learn about habits, daily routines. I just needed something from the COVID coma to get my butt in gear and stop just not doing the things I needed to do. What I didn't realize was it wasn't going to be about habits. It was really about unpacking the emotions that was stopping me from creating the life that I knew I wanted and what I really knew that God wanted me to have. So that's why we're talking about this. Jenna, I'm so glad you're here because we're going to talk about the roots. Yeah. We're going to talk about the depths of where the emotion comes from, how to get good at figuring that out. But first, thanks for coming on the podcast again.
Thank you for having me. It feels, when we were like talking about doing it, I was like, emotions are like my secret, my favorite thing. I'm like, because it changed my life so much when I went on this journey. I'm more logic based. So emotions was not like my default to like give them value. I kind of actually thought they were a waste of time. I was like, it works really well that I don't have them because it's so inefficient to have emotions. So until I got married, and then that did not work for very long.
I get that. I do. And I think that's why I wanted you here, because you have an ability to talk about emotions almost in a logical way, which sounds funny, but without disrespecting or devaluing them. So let's talk about emotions. Let's talk about unpacking it. How did you learn to start being healthy emotionally?
I think I've had to, honestly, if I get to the root of it first, I had to have a value for them. I think like I grew up in a Christian home, and my dad is so optimistic. It's a strength of his that I'm really grateful I inherited too. But I think the message that I heard as a little kid is that emotions aren't optimistic and it's not the joy of the Lord, so don't have them. Like skip to the right answer of what the scripture says versus processing to get there. So I first had to have a value that like, it's not a sin or I'm not bad for having them. And I think the missing piece for me really came, frankly, in marriage, and realizing that like some of the connection with my husband and intimacy that I really didn't notice missing in friendship, I didn't know how to get there. And it was emotions was the key to that. So if I didn't actually know what was happening inside of me, I wanted to be connected with my husband. I wanted to have like, we say vulnerability, but if you don't know emotions, you actually can't, like your emotional state and like the cocktail that's happening inside of you at any given time, you actually can't share how to be known if you don't know yourself. So I think that was a big shift for me of like, oh, this is actually a key piece to intimacy and connection. And then the beautiful thing as I've gone on this journey, I feel more connected to myself. It's really changed my marriage. It's changed how I show up in friendship. But then I think the piece for me that I have such a value that feels like the secret sauce. I think a lot of Christians think if you get in touch with your emotions, you'll become more selfish, because it becomes about you and your emotions. Well, what the difference for me was, it actually, if we're talking about intimacy, it increased my intimacy with the Lord, because it was like, I don't need a savior like before 10 years ago when I accepted the Lord, like that pain that I have right now that I'm aware of, like today, actually needs a comforter, and I have a source. So it made me turn to him for a source, like way more. Like Frank, this is not cheesy. I was like, oh, I needed Jesus so much more when I got in touch with my emotions. And then the beautiful part, as I started getting like care and comfort for like myself and for him, then I was able to show up less dysregulated with my husband, because it's like I had received a little bit for that. Where before, if my husband like didn't show up perfectly with my emotions, I was so like bankrupt that I was like, all bets are off. You're not safe. You're not worth it. So then there was like room, like now the practice that I have is like, I figure out what I'm feeling first. I like sit with it, and then I get some empathy, like compassion from the Lord, and a little bit of healing. So then when I go to my husband and share with him the vulnerability, if he shows up like the human that he is, there's some room for me to be okay, because I'm not like, I've already gotten a little care. We're going to keep going. It doesn't mean he's, like we're not going to talk it out if there's some like speed bumps, but I can show up so much less desperate and more grace, full of grace and mercy, especially because I just received, like I literally just received it. Therefore, it's easier to give when I'm like in touch with my emotions and then take them to the Lord.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's huge. I love how you unpack the idea of like, oh, I've got to actually recognize what I'm feeling.
mm-hmm.
And then I think a lot of times we skip the step, which is, well, at least in my home growing up, my mom was not emotional. So when she was not okay, she disappeared.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So like when mom's not okay, she disappeared. She came out, a couple hours later and she was fine. Or she was mad, right? Because she was really peaceful. Like in general, she was a very peaceful, joyful person. So it was mom's not okay. So what I learned early on was that if I'm mad, I need to get out of the room. Like if I'm not okay emotionally, I need to exit. Or what I learned was my dad was very emotional. We're going to aggressively go after this. And I'm going to force you to share what you feel. And I'm going to tell you what I feel. And you're going to own what I feel. And I'm going to own what you feel. And we're going to be fine. And we're not leaving the room until we get through this. So both of those have great space, which sometimes you need to actually get away and process. And then for others of us, we need to actually have someone say, you're not leaving. I love you too much to let you disappear. But in general, I had this kind of turmoil inside of me of when I'm mad and I don't know what's going on, I disappear, but I don't know the questions to ask myself as I've disappeared. Or when I'm really clear on my emotions, I had this idea that that person had to sit with me and I was going to hold them hostage until they admitted that they were the cause of that emotion.
Yeah.
And so that was a mess. An apology. Tears were helpful.
Yeah.
A couple examples. And then I would let them off the hook. Both of those weren't healthy. I just didn't know it.
Yeah.
And what it came down to is that I had no relationship with myself about emotions. I only had some habits that I watched.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I feel like a lot of us subconsciously reflect what we were shown or not shown, and we go to the opposite because we didn't like that, so I'm going to go try the other extreme, or that's what they did, so I'll do that because that's the healthy way to do it. But I think for me, what I've started doing is I think this reality that some of us are external processors. That means that you figure out how you're feeling, or you the root of things externally, and some are internal. So my husband is external, I'm an internal. So he would want to stay in the room. And the hard part for me was like, I actually don't know what I'm thinking or feeling, but I don't want to leave you either. And I would be the avoidant.
Oh, that's so
like,
good.
Sweep it under the rug. So one of the rhythms that we've built, like habits in our marriage, when we're experiencing emotion and we don't know what it is, if I need some space, I'll be like, hey, I'm feeling a lot of emotion right now. I use it just like a blank statement. I don't accuse him. I just talk about what's going on inside of me. I'm feeling a lot of emotions right now. Can I get like 15 minutes to figure out what's happening and then come back? Because the time limit makes him feel safe to know that I'm not trying to get out of it or avoid it, the conversation. He just knows that like he could back me into a corner, but I'm not going to have good information or the right information. And then the same is true where his like habit with his emotion being an external processor, especially if his emotions about me, he has a couple trusted guy friends that he processes. I think of it like a filter. Like I want to know what's happening inside of him. So like all of it he's going to share with me at some point, but get the rocks and sticks and dirt out of it. So there's not accusation or blame, or he figures out, oh, actually that's what I mean. Those 4 things were like on the way there, but this is actually what I mean. Okay, I'm going to go back and give this to Jenna. So I think deciding like how you operate and figuring out what's happening emotionally, and then giving room, like what does your partner, your friend, your spouse need, is super helpful. Like acknowledging both of those.
Yeah.
But then when you're in the space, we do a lot of marriage coaching and life coaching. I think a lot of times people take space and not know how to process through it. It just kind of, they stew in it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So
Yeah,
I think like the
absolutely.
forward motion through it. For me, I just have a few basic questions. Actually, I wrote them down because I was like, oh, what are my root questions?
I love it.
So when I'm taking space, when I'm trying to figure out what's the root of happening, very basically, I ask, what emotions am I feeling? And I would say that this is a big deal for me. I used to ask what's happening, but when I would ask myself what's happening, I'd get blamey. I would say it would be like, Aaron did this and that happened, and then he was sassy back or whatever. So it's actually what I found is less helpful to get kind of caught up in the details of context. I actually am wanting the space to know what's happening inside of me. So to own it, instead of points, like rev myself up with like ammo of how I missed it, I just ask what emotions are happening versus what happened.
And what if those that are listening go, I don't know what I feel, or I just feel angry?
Yeah. Well, anger is great. And then I would ask, why? Why do I feel angry? Because one, what was really helpful for us is we found like there's a lot of brain science that say our brains are actually wired to only feel 8 emotions. Like they've done this. Have you ever heard this? That like mapping our brains, and there's only 8 distinct places that light up.
Yeah.
So maybe we think of it like the primary colors. Like there's, red, yellow, blue. But then there's millions of shades of colors because you combine them and you get this nuance. So I think like, for instance, frustration's not on the 8 core emotions, but it would be a flavor of anger. So maybe it's a little bit of this and this, or anxious might be a little bit of fear, and then maybe some anger, or it could just be fear, whatever. So the idea of keeping it to the 8 was really helpful for me because it was like, I didn't feel overwhelmed. You know how like they say decision paralysis?
Yes.
If there were too many choices, because you can find them with like 50.
So keep it to the 8.
Keep it basic and 8.
And so do you go, I love the question because I'm just thinking about the listeners right now, and they're like, I just feel, angry because and you immediately go into the story. So you're saying stay out of the story, keep it to the 8, identify that one thing that you're feeling. And if it's,
I would say actually, I usually feel quite a few things
at the same time.
I would say that, it almost feels like a recipe. I don't know that I've ever felt just one thing. So that's actually helpful. I would say push deeper because I think we can get stuck in just one. Like I feel angry or I feel fear. Awesome. What else? So I kind of say with like my clients, I'm like, look for 3. Assume there's always 3 going on. So
what if someone feels weary?
I would say
tired.
that
I'm
probably
tired
like
of this.
lonely. Hurt,
Oh,
like
all
prolonged hurt is usually that, or lonely because if you feel weary, it's like there's not someone to share. So I just get more nuance of like, oh, what's the closest? But really when I'm like asking myself my own emotions, I actually make a bullet point I'll write it or I put it in my phone because I can keep it simple to like keep it ownership. When we start pointing the finger, like there's this line that's like, when you figure out you're 51% of the problem, awesome, because you have 51% of the solutions or control for the solutions. But when we get so camped on what they did, I'm like, you can't control them. So like, why wouldn't you spend more time? So anyways, then once I make my list, I'm like fear. Can I give you a real example?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the other day, my husband and his friends, they have like this, they wanted to meet one Wednesday a month for an hour. And he was trying to figure out a time that'd be the less hurtful and like make it work for our family. And I kept fighting. Like I would just, every time it came up, I'd be like, blah, blah, blah. And we like tease. It was a fight over stupid things. And finally I was like, wait, I think this is just logistics, but I think there must be an emotion. So can you give me a second? So then I just took a little space and went inward, and I was like, oh, I actually feel like some fear that he's more excited and cares more about having fun with his guys than me. So that'd be the first question. Like what emotion? I feel some fear. I feel some lonely because I want him to be excited to come home. I feel maybe hurt that he's prioritizing this so much, and when I'm doing this, if you notice, one of the things I had to get over because I didn't have a value for my emotions was judging myself. So instead of being judgmental that I felt something, if I went inward with a judgment, I would hide. They actually say that shame, like neurologists say that shame makes you disassociate. So if you actually are going to shame what you uncover, you will actually hide those parts of you. So until you can go in more like as a scientific, like curious with truly wanting to discover things, you probably won't find the info. So I had to like kick out shame. So I'm not going to shame what comes up. Yes, maybe it's going to need some healing. Maybe it's going to need some truth. Yep, that's probably what's going to happen.
What does shame sound like? Shame sounds like you're so
you shouldn't.
needy.
Yeah, or you shouldn't. You should be happy he's going to like has
it's
guy
not all
friends.
about you. Don't be selfish.
Like get over it. Like kind of like pushing myself along towards
Love
that. Or sometimes I think of shame can be pointed inward or outward. So like maybe sometimes people's stumbling block is like, I'm afraid that he cares more or whatever. So that's like judgment towards them. Be like, wait. No judgment either way. It's unhelpful and just getting to the roots. It kind of blocks real root discovery if you still like get camped in judgment. So then the next thing I ask myself is like, why am I feeling this? So if I'm feeling fear, I'm like, why am I feeling fear? Like, oh, because I think he likes hanging out with his guy friends more than me. So then I sit with them like, why do I think that? I know he chose me. Like I'm the only one who has a covenant with. And then I just kind of like ask myself like, what's happening with this fear? Like I know the emotion and I know the what's tied to it, but like, where did I learn this? Where is this coming from? And that when I sat with that, I actually realized like, oh, there's this little part of me, like a young part, like maybe a little girl part that wants to feel chosen. And I'm equating this with not feeling chosen. And that part of me, when I felt that instantly, my like goal is now when I find a root that's just truly what it is, like there's not judgment, there's not accusation, I turn to compassion, because that would be the opposite of judgment. Maybe before I would have been like, that's dumb. Don't feel that way. You're not 8, you're 38. Like get over it. Like actually it's actually really beautiful. I did this study in the Bible and realized how often when Jesus healed someone, he would ask questions. So he'd be curious. And then how often it was followed that he was filled with compassion. So he healed them. Like the compassion was the piece in between that led to the healing. So now with my emotions, instead of judgment, I feel the Holy Spirit. I like sit, I'm like, oh my gosh, of course that makes sense. Like you can see, like when I ask, where did I learn this? I have a couple examples that I won't share with you guys that I realized instantly in my childhood, that moment, right? That part with my dad, that part with my brother, my little self interpreted their actions to say that I'm not worth choosing. Like I'm going to be second to their desires or whatever. So then I'm actually not talking about this once a month meeting with my husband right now. That's why we keep missing each other, is because this emotion back here with these roots is making us fight about something else. And why we're missing each other is not better words or trying it a different way. I have to go handle the root or we're going to keep missing each other. And then it's beautiful because so after like, what did I say? I said, what emotion am I feeling? Why am I feeling that? Where did I learn it? And then when I get to the where do I learn it, I would say 90% of the time, it's pretty easy to connect with compassion, because I'm like, oh, of course, your 8-year-old self who didn't know any better, like took that message away from your dad having to stay at the meeting or whatever it was. Then I invite the Holy Spirit of like, how do you see this? And it's this beautiful moment where I just feel like it's like a soft part of my heart that like feels like there's splinters and it's like bleeding. And I'm like, what do you say to be true about this? And it's almost like I would say most of the time I have these little mini encounters. I almost think of them like self-sozos. Yeah. Sozo is another word for people who don't know, just inner healing, like with the Holy Spirit and stuff, where I have these little moments with the Holy Spirit where it's not a general verse that I'm trying to push myself through the emotion. It's that real specific part of my life that needs a savior, that needs a father who cares, that needs to feel seen, that needs some comfort. And, in those moments, it just naturally, I'm like, oh my gosh, I feel so grateful that I have an endless source of a perfect source of comfort, a perfect source of love, that then when I show up and explain to my husband, like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that we kept missing each other. I realized when I went away, asked myself, what, why, and where did I learn this? This is what I discovered. Like, we could talk about that conversation, but I'm so sorry that I was defending this. I didn't realize it. And then he's so soft because it's changed like my emotional awareness. If I could just give a plug for why it's worth it. If you can do this on a regular basis, go and sit with where the roots are coming from and then get a little compassion and care, it will change how you show up in communicating about your pain. Because you're no longer fighting, you're softly sharing. Yeah. And then if they miss it, no problem. Like there's people in my life that I'm in a relationship with. My husband's awesome about caring for the soft part that I'm showing him. But there are other people that aren't. So I would give them, I call it the 50 cents worth of vulnerability versus maybe my husband gets the $50 worth of vulnerability, where I have history enough to know that like they don't have the same tool set or value for this. So I'm not going to like keep opening up the depths, but not giving them any chance to respond differently than the story I'm telling myself. So I'll give them the 50 cent version. And then if they don't show up perfectly before I share, I remind myself like, hey, like they're probably not going to show up perfectly. You're probably going to be bummed that they're not as kind or maybe compassionate. Maybe they're still defensive. No problem. You can actually go sit with the perfect source of care like after this. You can actually have room for them to be human and you could still be okay because you have an infinite source. And it's just been so beautiful of like, oh, I feel like my awareness of how he's met me. And now when I find the emotion, instead of judging them, I'm like, oh, I've got answers to this. Like, this is time for an upgrade. This has been some faulty or like subconsciously this has affected how I've shown up in my marriage or in friendship. And if I get healing, I know that the next step after healing is freedom. So I'm like, oh, like, okay, this is wonderful. Maybe it's fun in the process, but I know where it leads. And that's worth it.
So I'm curious, this is brilliant and I love it. And I can feel tender too in that moment when you're sharing. What about the person listening that goes, it's always about that story in my childhood. It's always about that. And when I share it with somebody I love, they're like, when is that going to be? When are we done with the dad wound or the mom wound or the, where there's this real damage that's there that they're never going to understand. And it's linked, it's changed who you are. And so how much of it is, do we get healthy enough to where we can actually go into the secret place, deal, meet with God, do all that and say, I am purposely not going to use that story in this season or give them that story because I know they're not going to have ears for that.
I would say that's
without being dishonest about
totally. I would say that's a good qualification. I don't always tell everybody. The where I learned it is really personal and vulnerable. So I'd say I share that less often. The what I'm feeling, like what emotion I'm feeling and like why I'm feeling that is where I give more people because the what, like the deeper inner healing part of the root usually is between me and the Lord or maybe just like my husband or someone safe. But what I would say is that I think there's these things when I like discover emotional root and then they get healing and it's kind of like a one and done. You're like, oh, that was the course correction I need. But then there's others like I had some like personally some really hard parts of my childhood. So those were not a one and done because they were recurring over years. So I would get encounters or breakthrough like that the Lord would come in and it'd be beautiful. It almost feels like a bounce up, but then I'd still be walking out the healing and then maybe another bounce up. So in that, my like mental picture of those moments where I'm like, oh, this traces back to that. I'm familiar with that. Like you said, like father wound or mother wound could be a general statement. I do get a little more nuanced because I think if you go general, then like that's, like I just said, I could say, oh, that was a dad wound. But instead I realized like, oh, I want to be chosen and be shown that I'm worth someone's best attention. That specificity.
Yes.
Specificity. No. Good luck with that one.
Specificity.
That level of it gives me unique healing versus these general flybys that I don't actually usually experience. It's almost empowering dad wound versus
that's really good.
Get this like one more splinter.
Because it's more awareness. Yeah. Instead of just saying it's them. Again, it's the awareness of, oh, but I need this. And I didn't get that. I'm a little girl that didn't get it. What about
Wait, can I answer a little bit more? What I would say too, though, is I then, I think of that as like a brick by brick. So if there's these really big wounds from your childhood or your life, like traumas, I think of it like as there's a brick wall in the middle of your yard and you're probably going to have to take it down a few bricks at a time. What I'm not saying when I encounter it, that it's impossible or it gets to stay there, but also creating realistic expectation that it's probably not going to be a one and done. So like sometimes I'll trace something back and like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's this. I'm pretty familiar with it, but I'm going to take a few more bricks down. And then I get a moment where I'm like, hey, I'll remind myself we're not that little girl. Like we actually get to learn and grow in healing, and sometimes choosing to trust is going to be the path forward rather than saying this is just who I am. Like this wound is going to live there forever. So I'm like, oh, I'm actually risking a bit a bit to be like this friend, like I'm going to show up in a way that my childhood wound yells, back away or it's not safe. Like that's part of my healing to take another brick off of like, I can trust you, Lord, and the growth I've done to like push myself 1% beyond it. So
it's beautiful. My dad always says, within God, I have been healed, I am healed, and I will be healed. So there, no matter what's in our life, we are in the process. It doesn't mean that you haven't had healing. It doesn't mean that you aren't healed. It doesn't mean that you will be healed as well. Like it's always a process. And I love that idea of taking the brick. And then also how much of the wounding, and this is a whole nother part I don't want to get into too much, but that the wounded emotion becomes our identity. Yeah. And so instead of owning that part that says, I needed to be seen, I needed to be chosen, we just go, well, you know what? You're just, you can't be close to people. They hurt you or
Yeah.
whatever it is. And we just make an identity. So I'm curious, as you started this process, what happens when you, like you said, I don't share exactly the story all the time, but I will tell somebody how I feel. How do you communicate how you feel without it being shut down? Why? You don't need to be angry. You don't need to be sad. That's ridiculous. I didn't mean that, right? Of course. Or you're always angry. You're always, of course, I knew I was going to make you mad. I knew you wouldn't want to pick a weekend. Of course, you always are lonely, but I'm here all the time. So you know what I mean? Those narratives.
Totally.
So how do you stay true to that emotion and healing, like hold on to it in the middle of probably not everybody having open arms like Erin?
Yeah. No, I think two things. One, I stay really soft. Like, because I've already experienced a little healing and I'm not like deprived, like a starving person eats a meal versus someone. Yeah, I'm not on the defense, nor do I need them to. One of the things that we've really gone after into sharing my emotion is I can be okay without an apology. Like, my goal is not to make them admit guilt or give me an apology. It's just witness or to be a little bit more known.
Okay, wait, that's profound.
It's a huge
My goal
shift.
is not to get an apology
Or admit guilt. Those are the
admit
two
that
things.
they were wrong.
Yeah, because one of the
then
things.
How do you even have a relationship?
It's so real. But then the flip side, so then if your goal is to get a little bit of care and to be, or even just to be known and experience witness, maybe that would be a little broader, because care could be like, well, they're defensive, so that wasn't care. So
I think the idea of my goal is to be known, which is I'm giving you information about myself, which means I'm 100% in charge of that.
Yeah.
So I am telling you the truth. And that is the truth about me.
Yep, my experience. And then so just plainly, I say, we don't use you. A lot of people know this, that you did this, this, blah, blah, blah.
You don't need to feel.
Yeah. So I say I realized I took a minute because I was like, ouch, what's happening to me? And I realized that I'll use the verbiage of the story I was telling myself. So anything that I could use that owns, this is my, everything that's happening inside of me. I'm not good at, my husband and I have a really big boundary of not mind reading. So maybe it looks like you said you slammed a door, you did this, blah, blah, blah. So when you're pissed at me, maybe that would be no, actually the story I'm telling myself was,
Wait, so mind reading is
assuming, their heart motives. We do that all the time. I think that is why
I've never done that. I don't know what you're talking about.
Why conflict goes so well. You're I just know. If you ever catch yourself saying, and I know they were thinking, and I was
absolutely,
you're mind reading, just to let you know. So anyways, I'll tell him hey, the story I was telling myself was that it didn't matter if I came or not, because instead of saying you didn't care if I came or you couldn't, it didn't matter to you. Oh, that's actually telling them about themselves. You're going to get a more defensive person. And I remind myself, I actually just want care and witness. I'm not trying to prove anyone's guilt. We're not in the courtroom. That's one of the things my husband and I say all the time. We're not in the courtroom. We're sharing our emotions, not presenting a case. When you get to present a case with your emotions, you're oh, you're going to have a defensive person too. So anyways,
I love that.
And then when people, like you said, try to talk you out of your emotion, or I didn't mean that. I think of it I literally go, because this is one of the reasons I'll write down my emotions. Those are my anchor points, my 2 anchor points. And I won't follow their trail off, because I'm in relationship with some people who are pretty defensive and will want to edit or explain. Yeah. And I expect that. I'm hey, they're probably going to want to edit. They're probably going to be explained.
Yes.
I go in guarded against offense and bitterness for myself. You can be okay when they do that. This is your plan. If they try, if they start to talk about why, you'll listen until they calm down. And then you'll say I know, I just felt sad. I go back to the really basic. I'm wow. I know, I just felt lonely. You shouldn't have felt lonely. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I know. I was just pretty lonely, in that moment. Or it's hard. I don't want to stay here, whatever. So if you don't follow their lead or edit their details,
go in the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Or make it about something else, or bring it about the future or the past. A lot of people try to unpack too much at once.
And they'll try to unpack their own emotions. Well, you hurt me. I've seen that where you share, I feel like you didn't care, or I felt lonely, I should say, not you, but I felt lonely when you didn't respond. And then it's, you don't respond either.
Yeah, totally.
So then there's this dilemma of, I'm glad we're talking about our emotions. I'm glad you're finally saying that hurt you. I didn't know that. That's new information. So how do this is a really good question. No, totally. I get stuck in this, which is, oh my gosh, we're finally talking about something I knew was there, right? That I obviously knew you were angry or felt lonely or felt hurt. I'm telling you my hurt. You now feel total permission to share, but it's now deflecting into your story and I am not wanting to go that deep, or there's still no space for me in the middle of this moment. So how do you navigate that?
That's really real. I think just basics, if this is about a spouse or someone that you can actually control the dynamic, like talk about, my husband and I tease that we have rules of engagement, like kind of rules that we've agreed how we'll show up. And it's, do you ever remember like a talking stick? Like whoever has the talking stick gets to go. We don't go back and forth like that. So whoever gets the talking stick gets a complete share, while the other one's not adding their emotion or editing. It's your share. And then when you're like, okay, I think that's it, that's when they feel heard and with. And if I have emotions that happened afterwards, after like my first in phase 1 is just to listen and be with you. So pro tip, if someone's sharing their emotions with you, like just listen. And then after, like if I share, so this is in an ideal situation, I'll be like, hey, I had some emotions pop up while you were sharing. Do you have the capacity for me to share? So then I'm getting their permission.
Wait, Jenna, that's crazy.
It's so huge.
That's crazy. So you'll say, I had some emotions that popped up when you were sharing that. Do you have some space to hear that?
Yeah. I would say that probably takes 5 to 10 minutes.
That probably takes 5 to 10 years to learn.
Yeah. Self-control.
I don't think I've ever had an adult do that with me.
Oh, really?
Never.
Yeah. So
you, obviously like you, but like, but in general, I've never seen an adult do that.
It's profound because then they're choosing. And Aaron and I
are fully empowered to not be blindsided.
And sometimes I also say that if you're going to ask that, it needs to be an honest question. And what that means is that you're prepared for a yes or no. Because a lot of times people will ask these questions that only like you're going to get in trouble unless you.
It's like I have some things, and if you say no, then
you're in double trouble.
Yeah.
You're like
versus
So an honest question, and if you don't have the capacity, be like, I would like to hear your emotion, or like I would like to. I don't think after we undid that, I'm pretty fragile. I think of it like thin ice. So I'll speak about me. I won't say like, no, it's not your turn. But I'm like, can we talk about it this evening? Can we talk about it tomorrow? Can we circle back? I have to pick up my son from school, whatever. There's so real logistics that you might not have the time, or you just don't have the emotional capacity. That's another reason why being self-aware is helpful, because I don't want to make a mess. I want to show up for you well after you just showed up for me. And if I'm aware enough, like, I don't have that right now, but I want to, can we circle back? So that'd be one. The other thing I would say when people are sharing, if it's not someone that you get to create how you're showing up, if you don't have buy-in, if it's a random friend, or I actually share this way with like teachers at my kids' school, like dentist. I'll just like, but like 50 cents of vulnerable, not like,
you don't tell your
it's
dentist.
my childhood wound.
That's so funny.
Actually, it was really funny.
I have some emotions that came up when you told me that I owe you $1,000. Would you like me to share my emotions right now?
What's happening right now? Oh my gosh. Actually, hilarious story. My dentist, my son was in for a check, like a little cavity. And then they ended up calling me back. Like, I think we should actually pull this tooth, because he was younger. And he was like, he must have hit it at some point. So if we were to repair it with the cavity, the roots are already damaged. It wouldn't make sense. And I literally, as he's saying this, I'm flooded with like shame that like I've not been a good mom. Yep. And I didn't mean to, but I was just like, oh wow, I'm flooded with shame right now, realizing like my son's not gonna have a tooth, because he was 3 and he wasn't gonna have a front tooth anymore. I'm like, cool. Like I'm instantly thinking about all these scenarios. And I just said like, wow, I feel a lot of shame thinking about what does this mean for my job, how I've done as a job for a mom, that this is going to happen. And he just stopped, which I didn't mean to do. I wasn't trying to get a reaction from him. And he was like, you are not a bad mom. He's like, there are a ton of factors that went into this. And he's like, so if you could stop that story, he was like, please. He was like, you've done a great job. The fact that he's here. And he just went on and affirmed me. And then then I was able, afterwards I cried. I didn't want to cry with him, but I was like, oh. And then he was like, but let's talk about what we're going to do about it. Anyways, so it's just profound. But the sound,
again, it's different than someone saying, I'm such a terrible mom. It was my fault.
Yeah.
It's very different than I'm feeling ashamed that I may have missed something. Like some of the way you said it is less like you're a victim to it, or that you're just almost like identify with your failure. Yeah. Yeah. Like, oh, I'm just a mess. Yeah. It was my fault. Which
he didn't have to like pat me with my identity. I wasn't like, he just was like, oh, I can speak to that. If it's an adjustment, let me just give you this little factors. Yeah. It was really cool. So that being said, like you're going to do this with people who don't have a buy-in of how they're going to show up. And then, so if they share, so if that's the scenario you gave and they start unpacking, I'll just sit and I'll like, yeah, totally. Like if I have the time, and at the end be like, I'm if I can give an apology, great. Or like, I wouldn't want you to feel that way. Like, I didn't know that you felt. That's always honest. I think about what can I honestly give them? And in the heart of being generous, I want to give as much as I can. So maybe they want me to be the villain Maybe they want me to like admit I was terrible or had ill intentions, and that wouldn't be honest because I didn't. But like realizing they have a ton of hurt or pain, I could give that generously and be like, I would never want to hurt your feelings. Maybe what they assumed I was the message I was sending them is off, but I'll speak to the part I can care about, like that emotion that I'm seeing. So anyways, speak to what I can. And then when they're done, be like, I appreciate you sharing. I was like, I feel like I still like, or even just say like, I still feel hurt about that. So I'll let them have their moment. If you try to overtalk people, it just never really works. But I think you just keep it really simple. I truly just come back like, I know, I still feel sad. And if they get bigger or louder, I've been in conversations with people that they've tried like 4 different sidebars to try to, or explain to me in detail why I shouldn't feel that way.
Because they're uncomfortable with your emotion.
And I don't feel
know
bad,
what to do with that.
But the shocking part is if you literally keep coming back, like, I just feel sad. I have yet to experience someone who doesn't be like, I didn't mean for you to be sad.
They finally own it.
Yeah. They won't necessarily own it, but they'll give me like, they'll come down. Like,
okay.
I didn't want that, or I wouldn't want that. That wasn't my goal. Maybe sometimes people will be like, I'm sorry. They can hear it. But like, if you almost reminds me of like a toddler, let them spin out and don't follow them. That's most people miss it. When they follow them. Yeah,
I'm going to
stay
on the
here
rabbit
and
trail. We're
regulate it.
down into our childhood.
No, it's not about this. Come back. And I'm like, I know, I just feel sad. I just feel sad.
You're just bringing it back.
Yeah.
Bringing it back.
It's just about my emotion. It's just about my emotion. Not making a character slander, not making an accusation. I just feel sad.
You know, I've noticed in you, Jenna, that is evident in most emotionally healthy people is they have a high dose of compassion and empathy. And I think that's the secret sauce to actually, because I know in our friendship, I could share something with you and I would get compassion and empathy. But it's because I hear you give yourself that.
It's totally at Havilah. That was a huge takeaway for me. Like I said at the beginning, like I was afraid I was going to be more selfish and almost like protect or like uplift my emotions over everybody else's. But what happened is if you notice when I said that, I like awareness, curiosity, and then compassion, I actually give myself compassion before I invite God or the Holy Spirit in, because that was hard for me. That was not a skill. It was judgment that lived there. I know that God's going to be compassionate and healing, but I had to practice giving myself compassion. And then the flip side, which has been profound, is that at the level I grew the muscle of compassion, it wasn't just self-compassion, it was others. It almost, the Lord was telling me, he was like, it's like you dug a well. You thought self-compassion was its own well and the compassion for other. He's like, it's just compassion. So if you're doing on the work to get better at empathy and compassion, you're going to give it to yourself better and then other people better. You're going to show up both ways because you've dug a deeper well.
The well is joined together.
Yeah, it's the same.
It's brilliant.
So you give away. If you can give self-compassion, you're going to give it away. And that's actually helped me too when people are judgmental. I'm like, oh, they probably are really, what I'm experiencing is how they are to themselves. It's the same thing. As judgmental as they are to others,
very much so.
They are to themselves. So I have them like, that's like, oh,
yeah, that's what they have to live with.
That's turned inward, you know?
Okay. So one last question. I know we've got a long time, but what about the person that's listening to this and saying, I live with a highly emotional person who takes over all the oxygen in the room with their emotions, and I've hurt them and they're always scared and it feels like they dominate with the emotions. How have you navigated people that aren't healthy emotionally and seem to have the verbiage of what they're feeling and the story, but they have no maturity in it?
Well, sometimes I will let them go. One of the things that I've found is sometimes they're not used, or they like talk so much is because no one's ever like, they interrupt, or they're used to defending for a while. So they've like girded up their self-protection of, let me explain or I won't get the care I need. So I recognize how often it's like the self-protection, like I won't get the care anyone else. So if I show them I can hear it, I think a big deal for me is someone could judge me for or blame me for their emotions, but I will own, like I'm really good at owning, but I'm not going to step in the line of blame. So I can sit with someone for a while with their emotions because it's not adding to the weight of my guilt. Like, or a verdict against me. Some people like have a limit because they're like, oh, you're telling me how bad I am. I'm like, I'm not listening. I'm not hearing this through that lens ever. So your emotion is not, the more you feel is not the more bad I am.
So what is your lens then for that?
That I hear, I'm like, oh, they're in a lot of pain. So I'll wait. Usually I can wait them out. If they start talking about me, I do have some basic boundaries of name calling or yelling or cursing at me. Those are like, okay, I would love to hear about your pain. This is what I do. So if someone's in like that level, like I'd love to hear about your pain. If you, I can't stay here though. If you're going to call names, curse at me or yell, I have to leave. So then I had a relationship. I had to do that for months before they could they'd respect that. And then they'd call back or like come back and be like, I'd love to hear about your emotion. It's like a white flag of like, hey, if you're here, like I'm someone who's here to listen, but if it's going to be like, I don't know,
accusatory
or hit
aggressive,
these
right.
things, I won't be able to stay. So I'm like, if you want that, this is how the terms are for care, So then finally they listen. And so if that's not the term, then I would just say like, I'm so sorry you feel sad. I'll kind of reflect back what I hear. I think a lot of people try to solve. So that's why they have like this limit, or the limit of how much they could listen is because this is how bad I am. And I'm like, neither of those things are my ownership, or how I want to show is just empathy and witness. And that changes my capacity for length and how I can sit people. And then after they're done, I'll be like, what do you need? Like, what would feel helpful? Because if I'm so lonely, so hurt, blah, 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 whatever, I let it go. And then I'd be like, well, what do you need? And then that's what takes people out of stewing into like action. And I would say a lot of times people don't know. No, because they're used to like, wait, you care? Or like, you didn't run away. I didn't scare you off. So then it like, maybe I don't know, be like, okay, do you want some ideas? Like, would you want to brainstorm together what this could look like? Or do you want to let me know and come back to me? So like, let me know when you do. Like, hey, well, if you figure that out, like, let me know. Because I'd love to figure out a win-win, like what I could do differently. Because some of my friends, I'm not good. I'm famous for accidentally hanging up on people. You've experienced this. Because I think we're done. And they're like, cool, done. Like frivolous end talk where I'm like, bye, love you. Have a great Monday. And I'm like, why are we doing this? We just talked for like 20 minutes. I don't understand.
So you do the movie hang up.
Yeah.
Because the movies, they're like, okay, click. And no one says anything.
No.
But in real life, you're like, goodbye. Have a great day.
And my mother-in-law's like, look.
The movie hang up. Yeah.
So there's certain people that have been like, I felt so hurt, blah, blah, blah. And then I could just be like, okay, what do you need? I'm like, okay, they need for me. Like, they're like, never hang up on me. I'm like, okay, what does that look like logistically? And actually getting to real, almost like habits that you would like, but it's not like they have to prescribe my behavior change.
Totally.
I'm like, let's put this on the blueprint to see like what I could do based on that. Like, what if I called you twice?
But admit what you need, which I think is the core.
And that's like action versus stewing.
Someone saying, I don't like it when you hung up on me, is them owning that. And that's really, that can take a long time.
Like what do you need from that? Like what would be helpful for next time?
I love that.
And then you're not at the mercy of the exact first thing they say. I think people think like, well, they're going to tell me. I'm like, no. It's like a negotiation. Like, okay, I want to be with you. I'm not able to do that. This is what I could do. Like, that's not it at all. Okay, what about this? And then like, oh, okay. Yeah, let's try that. Let's see how it works. Like, okay.
Yeah. Brilliant. Jenna, this has been brilliant. Now, I know you do this a lot in Habit Lab. So let's talk for just a minute, because I know it's going to be open registration September.
I would say that's the biggest feedback I get is people are like, I thought I was going just in for the logistics of the habits, but it's such a holistic approach where we look at the emotion. Someone was like, it's a heart-centered approach to habits. And that's why I love emotional roots so much too. So if that's what you're looking for, registration should be open now. Yeah. There's a link in the bio. It's 10 weeks where there's a little bit of homework, but then a lot of people are like, this is great. I want someone to help me dig in. And that's what I do in the course, like as a coach, group coaching, and then the small group component is like teaching you this new muscle. If this is so foreign to you or you don't know where to begin, I'd recommend.
It's brilliant. And couples have done it. Yeah. We've seen, grandmothers that are like,
people
I need to learn
this.
2
and 3 times. We've had alumni. They're like,
a lot of people.
I got it, but then I needed to go deeper. So.
Yeah. And and we've had closest friends that have said they've done it twice.
Because most of the habits are like, why are you doing it? Or what aren't you doing? What emotion do you feel about eating healthier or exercise? Let's look at that before we even build any of the behavior.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I really hope you guys will consider Habit Lab. I'm so grateful Jenna was here. You guys could tell this could be a 3-episode conversation. I have so many things I want to talk about that I'm like, oh, I wish we had time. But I mean, the things she shared today, I think if we started using them in our everyday life, it would change our marriages. It would change, honestly, the biggest, most important relationship, which is the relationship with ourselves and with God. So listen, I really hope you'll go back and listen to this. If you think of somebody in your life that you want to start practicing this with, like my husband's going to get a link to this conversation, make sure and send this to them so that they know. And then it's a great way to start the conversation of having a healthy emotional relationship together. If nothing else, we're so glad you're here, and we're going to continue the conversation in the next couple episodes. So make sure and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode, and sign up for Habit Lab. It's live right now, and it does close its doors at a certain point because they go together. So make sure you join that, and you can still do your everyday life while learning healthy habits and emotional habits. All right, you guys, that's it, and I'll see you next time.